Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi. Today, we're having a debate on whether or not God exists between inspiring philosophy and apostate prophet. Let me go ahead and pull them up here. So, welcome both of you to the channel. This is inspiring philosophy is probably like 11th time on the show, but this is apostate prophet's first time on the show. So, I want to give him just a little time at the outset to explain who he is if you haven't heard of him. Which more than likely you're here because you know about these two, my two guests, before you know about Capturing Christianity or this channel at all. In any case, both of their channels are linked in the description of this video. They are YouTubers, and Inspiring Philosophy is a Christian apologist YouTuber, and Apostate Prophet. He is an apostate prophet. He was a member of Islam, and he eventually abandoned that, and now he identifies as an atheist. And so today, though, we're talking about whether or not God exists. And so, Apostate, it's great to have you on the channel.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. You can just call me AP or Apostate Prophet, whatever. Apostate sounds a little bit like you're attacking me or something. I don't know.
Well, maybe I should attack you. So, all right, AP, and then IP, or I'll just call you Michael because that's how I know you. It's great to see you again, man.
Yeah, great to be back again for the 12th time or something.
Yeah, it's a lot. All right, so let me let you guys know what's going to happen today in this debate. So this is actually a formal debate. I don't always, when I host discussions like this between Christians and non-Christians on my channel, it's not always like a formal kind of structure. A lot of times it's like an informal discussion, but today it's formal. So we're actually going to do 15-minute openings, 10-minute rebuttals. I'm just giving you a kind of overview of what's going to happen today. 10-minute cross-examine, 5-minute closings, and then we're going to do 30 minutes of Q&A after all of this. Everything will be timed, and actually, Michael has some slides to present and everything, so it's going to be a lot of fun. So, yeah, I've already said that both of these guys are linked in the description. Let's go ahead and get into it. But before we do that, actually, I want to start things off on a sort of lighter foot, and I want to ask you guys a question. So here's the question. Has nothing to do with the topic of the debate at all. All right, so if you could compare yourself to an animal, what would it be and why? I'm actually really curious to hear what you guys have to say about this. So AP, how about you?
I sometimes think about this question.
Really?
And yeah, I think recently I have compared myself to an owl.
Okay.
And that is because, not necessarily because of what an owl eats and does, but because of this mysterious appearance of an owl just hanging out at night by itself and observing its surroundings. I don't know. That's it.
Interesting. All right, IP. This isn't going to take long, guys. It's going to be fun. What animal are you like?
Pigeon.
Permanently exhausted pigeon.
No, I would say a cat. I want to be left alone, except when I don't want to be. I'll show up only when there's food, but I don't know what I want to eat. So if you put food in front of me, I'm probably like, I don't know if I really want that. But I do want food, and I'll keep complaining until I get it. So, yeah, just a very annoying cat, probably.
All right, fair enough. All right, let's get to it. So I'm going to pull up the screen for Michael for you to start sharing your slides. And whenever you're ready, I'll start the timer up in the top right corner, and we'll get going.
All right, well, I'm ready to get going. Well, again, I've been looking forward to this. I'm glad we finally were able to get it set up. We've been trying to get it set up for months now. And I thank AP for agreeing to discuss the topic tonight. So diving right in, I want to note on the get-go, I would call myself a classical apologist. So that means I'll be arguing for a theistic or a deistic worldview, and it's more probable than a non-theistic worldview. So I don't claim I can prove God exists, and I won't be arguing for Christianity. I'll be arguing for basic theism. If I can't get anyone to there, it's pointless for me to try to get you to Christianity. First, by God, I mean a necessary immaterial mind that created the universe. At this point, there's no need to argue for anything beyond that. So I'll present two arguments. The first one I'll present is called the digital physics argument. Based on feedback from my last debate with Matt Dillahunty, I was asked to simplify it. So here's a simplified version. If the universe is emergent, it is emergent from a mind. Premise 2, the universe is emergent. Therefore, the universe is emergent from a mind. I'll start by defending the second premise here. Let's begin with the data. In several videos, I've expanded upon this, but I presented various lines of evidence that space-time, our universe, is emergent and not fundamental. So in the hunt to rectify quantum mechanics with relativity, physicists discovered something known as the holographic principle. Now, this theory was discovered from the physics of black holes, and it suggests the entire three-dimensional universe can be seen as two-dimensional information. In other words, the whole three-dimensional universe and the particles that make up reality would emerge from underlying information processing of quantum field theory. In 2017, a peer-reviewed study published observable evidence for the holographic principle. From looking at irregularities in the background radiation, the team found that simple equations of quantum field theory could explain almost all cosmological observations. It was marginally a better fit than the standard model, and it was able to explain certain anomalies. So this line of evidence suggests the universe, space-time, is not something like a fundamental object, but an emergent construct contingent on a more fundamental reality. Now, the emergent features of space-time can be seen elsewhere. Another study argued quantum entanglement is an inevitable feature of reality. To quote directly, we show that any theory with a classical limit must contain entangled states, thus establishing entanglement as an inevitable feature superseding classical theory. Now, for those who don't know, entanglement is essentially the idea that if you take two particles that you share a quantum state with them, and then you separate them by a great distance, if you affect one, you'll instantly affect the other. You could place them on opposite ends of the universe, and change the one would instantly affect the other. So the implication is the space between them is not transferring the information. The information transfer happens on a more fundamental level where there is no space, implying space is like secondary or emergent, not a fundamental aspect of reality. Strengthening this, another study found evidence of non-locality even when two particles were not even entangled. Thus, as the slide is meant to show, what this means is the information between particles is not affected by space. It can be transferred instantly. So to sum it all up, non-theist Sean Carroll says space is obviously not fundamental. Space is something when you go from classical mechanics to quantum mechanics, space more or less disappears. The implication is space is not fundamental for the underlying world of quantum mechanics, but an emergent phenomenon of the macro or classical world that only exists after measurement. So like with the holographic principle, the evidence implies all of space-time is emergent. Now, I can argue the emergent nature of matter and space-time from numerous other areas, be it quantum mechanics, Brian Whitworth's features of a virtual reality, or many other ways. But the idea of space-time is emergent and not fundamental is accepted by physicists today. Leonard Susskind says that it's just mainstream physics now. Physicist Hyeon-Seok Yang says emergent space-time is a new fundamental paradigm for quantum gravity. The most up-to-date evidence suggests all of what we experience, space, time, and matter, all seem to be emergent constructs, not fundamental aspects. Okay, but now the question is, so if space-time is emergent, how does this relate to God? All right, I'll now begin by defending the first premise here. Now, the classical world, our universe, emerges from the underlying information of the quantum realm. Remember, as Sean Carroll said, space emerges from this space is not fundamental, it's emergent. Physicist Brian Greene notes in his book, one of the implications is that probably the fabric of space-time would be composed of more fundamental spaceless and timeless entities. So how could I, as a theist, argue that they are mental when talking about these spaceless and timeless entity beneath space-time? Well, interestingly enough, the same underlying features of the quantum realm have been seen to parallel aspects of mind or mental thought processes. In 2009, physicist Diederik Ertz published a paper noting that our cognitive processes can be readily modeled using the mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics. So, our inner world, our world of thoughts, qualia, dreams, emotions, can be modeled in terms of quantum processes. These same processes that we just discussed that give rise to space-time and matter. So, space-time and matter are emergent from the quantum realm within Hilbert space, which is a spaceless and non-physical. And our inner world of consciousness and mind can be modeled via quantum processes through the study of quantum cognition. So this would suggest the evidence implies what space-time emerges from would be similar or indistinguishable from the properties of a mind. And the simplest explanation is if the universe is emergent from a mind. What the universe emerges from resembles a mind, it's far more parsimonious and plausible to suggest it resembles a mind because it is a mind. This is also backed up by the work of astrophysicist Franco Vazza and neurosurgeon Alberto Filiti. They wrote a paper on the similarities between neural networks and brains and the cosmic web of galaxies. A new paper was just published a few months ago. They show the properties of neural networks and brains are similar to the cosmic web of galaxies, something we would expect if the universe is emergent from a mind. Just as brains would be the images of minds, the universe also appears to be the image of a mind. So once again, the argument can run as follows. The universe is emergent, it's emergent from a mind. This is supported by the research of quantum cognition, which shows the properties of the mind are similar to the features of the underlying quantum realm from which space-time emerges, and the work of Vaza and Felitti, which show the emergent universe manifests in similar ways as neural networks. So I'll move on to, and then, of course, the second premise, universe is emergent. Therefore, the universe is emergent from a mind. And this mind is what we call God. God is just a title for the mind behind the universe. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. So that's how that first argument runs. With the second argument I'll present it, we'll arrive at the same conclusion, just in a different way. I call this the cosmic conscious argument, named for Eugene Wigner's work. And I'm going to go through this one premise at a time instead. So premise one, contingent minds either have personal explanations or natural explanations. This is not a controversial premise. Almost all theories of the mind would hold to a reductionist type view, meaning that the mind would be assembled from smaller parts or particles, or you could believe that consciousness is irreducible and it would have to come from some sort of fundamental source. The controversial premise would be premise two. Quantum mechanics and other fields of science imply the natural universe is emergent from information processing and consciousness. Now, this is controversial, but it can be argued from the data to support it, like the data I just used to support the digital physics argument. But essentially, I can also argue from numerous experiments in quantum mechanics, which suggest that consciousness plays an important role in wave function collapse and the appearance of material reality. I can get more into this later, but essentially I can argue from experiments like interaction-free experiments, delayed choice quantum eraser experiments, the violation of the Leggett inequality in 2007, and the confirmation of the Cauchy-Spector theorem in 2011. This all leads to the philosophical inference, consciousness causes collapse. Now, the number one objection I'm sure is already happening in the live chat is that interaction or decoherence alone is enough to explain wave function collapse. But this is a popular misconception. Decoherence or macroscopic interaction is not an interpretation of quantum theory. Does decoherence solve the measurement problem? Clearly not. What decoherence tells us is that certain objects appear classical when they're observed, but what is an observation? At some stage, we still have to apply the usual probability rules of quantum theory. Physicist Maximilian Schleierhaus says, decoherence arises from a direct application of the quantum mechanical formalism to a description of the interaction of a physical system with its environment. By itself, decoherence is neither an interpretation nor a modification of quantum mechanics. So just because particles are interacting, that doesn't mean that's causing collapse. It doesn't actually solve the whole issue with wave function collapse. So, and of course, we've also observed collapse in experiments where interaction is where you give an interaction-free example. So, as physicists like John von Neumann, Henry Stapp, Fred Kuttner, Bruce Rosenblum, Bernard Hash, Richard Conn-Henry, Stephen Barr, Ian Squires, etc., all argue this philosophically leads to the conclusion consciousness ultimately causes collapse. Notice this is coming from actual physicists. Henry Stapp says the logical situation in quantum theory is quite different. There is an absolute logical need for something else, such as consciousness. So it follows that the appearance of material reality is emergent from consciousness, not the other way around. Conclusion one, the natural universe cannot be the explanation of contingent minds. Basically, what I'm trying to say is if matter is dependent on consciousness, then matter cannot give rise to consciousness. This is also supported philosophically. Take bundle theory. The idea is that physical objects are consistent of properties and nothing more. If you remove the properties, there's nothing less to describe an object. So take an apple. How you know it's an apple is by its properties. You describe it as red, round, shiny, tasty. But if you remove all these properties, is there anything left to describe it? Is there anything left there that would qualify as an apple? Well, probably not. Philosopher Susan Schneider puts it like this. Pure property ontology needs to take physical objects as metaphysically derivative, even objects that physics regards as fundamental. Objects are instead bundled out of properties, or they are properties. So likewise, another example, if you touch water, you experience wetness. But wetness is only a mental sensation. Wetness only occurs when a mind experiences water. The same applies with taste sensations. Sugar does not taste sweet unless there is a mind there to experience it. All of what we experience appears to be a world of mental properties. Philosopher Keith Ward puts it like this. Any physicist will say that brains are mostly empty space in which molecules, atoms, electrons, and other strange particles buzz about in complicated ways. It seems as though physical objects, when not being observed, have no colors and no sounds, smells, or tastes either. Sounds like colors are not physical events. Neither are smells, tastes, or sensations. Things do not smell like, taste like, or feel like anything when nobody is smelling, tasting, or feeling them. The physical world, it seems, is totally vacuous. No colors, sounds, smells, tastes, or sensations. What on earth is left? So all of the physical can be explained entirely in terms of mental properties, correlating with the same conclusions we got from the scientific research. Premise 3. The explanation of the existence of conscious minds is personal. This follows from the idea that each of us have beginning points. We're not necessary. So our consciousness would likely come from a conscious source. This is the same reasoning J.P. Morgan uses in his argument from consciousness. Premise 4, this personal source is what we call God. Again, God is just a title. Conclusion, therefore God exists. So I'll wrap up, and here's the challenge. So unless a skeptic can demonstrate consciousness is emergent from the brain, and trust me, I'm willing to go over studies in neuroscience, the most likely explanation is consciousness is irreducible, and this will be grounded in a personal source, as J.P. Moreland argues. This is also supported by philosophical arguments like indivisibility of personhood, unified visual perceptions, bundle theory, as we went over, and the irreducibility of consciousness. So contingent minds like ourselves would most likely be contingent on a larger consciousness that controls reality and brings other contingent minds into existence. And this is who we call God. So, two arguments. Both point to a mind as the cause of the universe, using the most up-to-date scientific research and philosophical inferences. Thus, before studying if a specific religion is true, we should at least accept basic theism or deism, and that we are the result of a mind behind the physical universe. All other questions like why is there evil, why did God create, what are God's plans are secondary questions. And we would not necessarily, they don't really address the data points or the conclusion of theism. Theism could be true and those separate questions could remain unanswered. For example, we know gravity explains the motion of the physics of large objects, even if we don't understand how gravity works on the quantum level. Gravity can still be an explanation, even though we cannot fully explain gravity. Evolution can explain how species come about, even if we cannot explain every missing link. So evidence seems to point to there being a mind behind the universe, even if we don't understand all the intentions of the mind. But we can get into those other specifics later if necessary. So with that, I will concede the rest of my time, and I look forward to hearing what AP has to say. Those are my two basic arguments. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that, Michael. And Apostate, sorry. AP, whenever you're ready, let me go ahead and pull up the screen here and make sure that I've got the timer up. And yep, so when you're ready, I'll start the timer and we'll be good to go.
Okay, just give me a second. Okay, I should be ready.
All right, go ahead.
I'm ready. Mm-hmm. So thanks to Cameron, thanks to Michael, and thanks to everyone who is and who will be listening. Thanks for giving this opportunity. I'm really glad to be here. First off, I want to say that I'm not here to prove anything. I'm not a professional debater. I'm not here to win. As much as I would like to destroy Michael here and scream, "You are finished, boy," I am here to simply exchange ideas. The question that we're dealing with, the question that we're debating and that we're seeking an answer for, is not a question that has a definite answer. It's not a question that we can thoroughly analyze and thereby obtain an observable, objective answer. It will always only be picked up by people and used and interpreted in different ways. Something that Mike says today or something that I say today might be taken and turned into completely different shapes. No matter what our position on the question, does God exist, is, we could assume all kinds of varieties of positions, back them up and to justify those positions with numerous arguments. And we could find suitable citations for every reasonable or absurd thing that we can present today, and then consider them proof. Whether I have the better answers today or Mike, they will simply be nothing but our answers, supported by our arguments, which we or our listeners consider strong because we are convinced or because we want to confirm that we are indeed right about our conclusions. I want to acknowledge that neither of us will be right today. We will only have shared our conclusions because that's what we like to do. We can't prove anything. Science will not prove anything for us. We cannot prove anything with science. All we can do is to draw conclusions from certain scientific observations logic, psychological observations, history, anthropology, and so on. And then from those conclusions deduce that there must be or can be or can't be, or that there is no God. I want to make use today a little bit of science, a little bit of history, and a little bit of psychology to address the question with three different points and perspectives. The first point would be that there is disorder and meaninglessness in the world as opposed to order and meaning. The second point would be that God arises from the human attempt to explain natural functions and phenomena, which is an extension of the argument of the God of the gaps. And thirdly, I would like to address this issue briefly in terms of the psychology of religion, the psychology of belief, or religious experience also. To come to the first point, that there is disorder, that we are surrounded by disorder. There is an age-old notion going on which dominates religious debates, which has always dominated religious debates, that there is a balance, that there is order, perfection, stability, that there is something intelligent in the world. But this couldn't be further from the truth. We are surrounded by chaos and meaninglessness. We don't exist within and because of order. We exist despite chaos, despite disorder. Our existence is no sign of order. On the contrary, our observations are evidence of disorder everywhere. We are on a planet that is not entirely stable. Natural disasters are everywhere. We are surrounded by cruel climates, destructive earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunamis, floods, storms, unpredictable volcanoes, meteors. Our planet is constantly full of disorder. In its recorded history, it was hit by giant objects that caused vast groups of animals to go extinct forever and serve no purpose whatsoever. In our recorded history, we have numerous species that have gone extinct, including nearly or intelligent species. We have dealt with harsh climates and changes of our worlds. Inhabited lands have disappeared from the map within the last millennium. A flood known as the St. Marcellus flood, for example, or also known as the Great Drowning of Men, changed the map and created islands in Europe in the 14th century. That actually happened. It changed maps. The world changed within the last 2,000 years or 1,000 years. On top of that, we have lived in deserts, in freezing, cruel climates. We have adapted to different standards. Humans have waged meaningless wars and died in masses for no significant reason. If you look back at history, you see that people have died in so many conflicts in masses for seemingly no purpose, for things that were very important to them, but that carry no importance to us or to anybody anymore. We have just died like mindless animals. If aliens were observing us for the last 2,000 years, they would probably think, what the hell are these people doing? But they would probably not think that, just as when we look at the animals around us, many of which have gone extinct, we don't wonder why these people keep fighting and keep killing each other and surviving. We just observe that as something beautiful. We have documentaries about that stuff. We watch animals kill each other in the most brutal ways, senselessly, in the most cruel ways. To us, that's just how they are. And to them, all the curious things that we developed intelligent humans do, including slaughtering those animals for religious purposes, have no meaning at all. All those things have only meaning to us, not to them. It is entirely subjective. Departing from that, not to mention we have numerous diseases, different diseases, many of them originating from the fact that our human bodies randomly are incapable of functioning properly, even if you live a very healthy life. If we look at our solar system alone, we see that our Earth orbits the sun not in a perfect circle, contrary to popular belief and depictions, but rather in a quite irregular way. There is no perfect pattern to it. Scientists are not sure whether this orbit is stable or whether it will change in the future. Many of them figure that it will not stay stable. In our solar system, we have numerous objects that meaninglessly roam this system, causing trouble or just floating forever. Just recently, we have begun talks about possible asteroids hitting the Earth in the next 100 or thousands of years, causing a danger of possibly destroying this planet and causing mass extinction. Many planets in the solar system exist beside our own and are only full of chaos, full of storms and lightnings. They can't be home to life. They serve no purpose at all. And some of them are even surrounded by numerous moons that have absolutely no meaning. For most of these objects, if they suddenly disappeared, including major planets around us, if they suddenly disappeared, nothing would change as far as we know. They would have no significant impact. Their disappearance would have no significant impact to the flow of things as they are. If we look outside of our solar system, our galaxy is full of rogue planets that float in the void forever because they were ejected or probably never orbited a stable star. And they just float into the nothingness, a state that we, our Earth, could also be thrown into, possibly, hypothetically. On top of that, the consensus among scientists is that if climate change affects our planet, we would not be wiped out anytime soon. We would simply adapt to a new way of living, maybe under harsher circumstances. So, long story short, there is disorder, there is chaos, there is meaninglessness everywhere around us, and we exist in the middle of it. And despite all of this chaos, not due to some order and some great meaning, not some perfect balance, some perfect flow of things, it is nice to believe that we exist for a reason and there is some great meaning and order. But looking at the cosmos as we see it now and observing that we are on one rare planet that is kind of suitable for life, not perfect for life, while most planets that we see and are not, and some planets might be, it is rather absurd to assert that there is order, that there is meaning, that there is some great, fantastic design behind all of this. Because what we see is that most of what exists right now is meaningless and a failure. Moving on to the second point, that we humans attempt to explain functions and phenomena with gods. It is easy to explain everything right now about the universe and the galaxy and solar system and all that. But this is all very new knowledge. Like 100 years ago, we didn't really know about the universe. The knowledge that we are in a giant universe with many galaxies emerged only 100 years ago. Throughout history, people have explained so many things, so many functions in the natural world by using gods and divine origins. Trees, plants, wine, food, love, life, death, war, fate, lightning, water, light, wind, sky, moon, sun, and all these things. People had gods and divine origins and explanation for all of that. They saw a lightning, they heard a sound of thunder coming with it, and they thought, okay, this must be happening because there is a person, a god, a mind behind that. The issue is that all these things always turned out to be wrong until everything evolved into one God who is apparently behind everything and who is hard to perceive and to explain. But that is only relevant to us now in our conversation because of Christian and Islamic supremacy. If we went to India, for example, things would depend on the Hindu godhead, and they would have completely different explanations for all of this. Buddhists, a major culture, don't even believe in a divine origin and divine creator. In many other cultures, people have non-theistic beliefs. If we look at the history of humans trying to explain these things with divine origins, we see that nothing ever turned out to be supernatural. All those beliefs, all those assertions always turned out to be wrong. There is not a single example of something that we attributed to God and it turned out to be God. So 100 out of 100 guesses were wrong. So it is quite pointless to still dwell on that. Contemporary scientist, for example, said, every time you understand something, religion becomes less likely. I think this very nicely captures, James Watson, scientist, I think this very nicely captures how humans have evolved to forget, to give up blaming everything and crediting God for everything. It is rather baffling that we still dwell on this age-old explanation and don't focus on exploring and understanding the space, the universe around us in a better way. But I understand that because humans want to believe. And here I want to come to the final point, which is the psychology of religion, the psychology of belief. I understand why people want to believe. Psychology understands why people want to believe. Believing in something makes life easier. It is hard for humans to accept the fact, the idea that life simply goes on without us, that after we die, we simply cease existing. As we did not exist before we were born, and that people simply go on without us, that everything just goes on. It is hard to accept that goodness will remain unrewarded and evil will remain unpunished. We constantly think about why life is the way it is. We try to seek some pattern in everything, and we try to explain life as fair or unfair, when in reality life is neither fair nor unfair. Life is simply life. There is no greater design, no structure to it. If we observe human history, we see that for everything, the cause and effects that happened in our life were natural, or we were the creator, the designer of those causes and effects. It was never God. In fact, even in Christian theology, there's this idea that that the things we are doing are for us, not for a God, evolved over time. Like Kierkegaard, for example, said that humans pray not to change the nature of God, or not to influence God, but to influence ourselves. And this keeps developing, the idea that we are not actually doing anything to God, but that we are simply doing this for ourselves. Believing and worshiping is easy because it takes off the burden of ourselves. It makes us focus on something outside of ourselves. It takes off your mind from yourself. What is interesting, however, is that psychology and neuroscience explains that religion can be psychologically and neuroscientifically explained. For example, famously, Andrew Newberg, who is a neuroscientist, works in neurotheology, and he has been observing Buddhists and nuns during their religious practices, and he observes that the Christian nuns in their meditation and the Buddhists in their meditation have the same brain activities. The same things are going on in their brain. And mind you, the nuns believe in the one God. Buddhists don't believe in a God or anything. They don't pray, they don't worship. They simply meditate and try to be a better version of themselves. Neuroscience also finds that psychedelic drugs have the same effect as religion. Drugs and sex have the same effect. Those things are just more tangible, which is why they're stronger, and it is more easier to be attached to them. But it is, of course, easier to explain religion from a morality aspect and to believe in that. So psychology acknowledges that religion, worship, makes us happier, that it makes life easier. But there are also alternatives to that, like meditation, yoga, different forms of activities that people do nowadays with which they find happiness in easier and more reasonable ways that we can actually explain, and without relying on ancient ideas of a divine. As a result, we see that there is no reason at all to believe in a God, because it is absurd by science, mathematically and historically improbable, and apparently only a human wish. And the only result I can have from this is that the idea of God can simply be dismissed without further question.
All right. Well, thank you for that, AP. And I always feel awkward, actually, in between, like in a formal debate, in between like the opening statements and like the next person, because like, are we supposed to talk? Are we not? I don't know. All right. Well, let's move to again. So if you're just joining us, we're in the middle of a formal debate. We're doing 15-minute openings, which we've just finished. We're about to head to 10-minute rebuttals. And then we'll go to cross-examine, closings, and then we'll do some Q&A. So if you want to send your questions in now, that's totally okay. The only thing is that I probably won't be able to go back to your question unless you send it as a super chat, which probably more than likely today, those are the only kinds of questions that we'll be able to get to. All right, with that, let's get to Michael's first rebuttal. Let me go ahead and change the timer here to 10 minutes as opposed to 15. And all right, whenever you're ready.
All right, yeah, well, thanks for that, AP. I appreciate a lot of the insight and arguments you presented. I'm going to try to just go through them and address what I can. I wrote down a whole bunch of notes here. And yeah, I totally agree with you to start off that I don't like really talking about winners and losers in debates. It's more about presenting ideas and seeing where we're coming from. This isn't a football game. So I want to start out by noting that a lot of what you said I did address in kind of the end of my closing. These are secondary questions we're asking. why the universe is the way it is could still exist with the existence of a God. God could be running an experiment, perhaps. He could be running a simulation to see what a chaotic universe would look like. That wouldn't really disprove the existence of God. It would just be something else with regards to the whole ontology. I wouldn't really call it chaos. I would say that God created more of a random universe, a universe imbued with randomness and with free will. In a more Christian perspective, so Jordan Wesley and Jordan Rasmussen wrote a paper addressing this called A Random-Based Theodicy for Evolutionary Evils. And one of the things they're basically noting in there is like, so God has sort of, what is God to do? If he creates beings a certain way, he's going to give them already natures, and they're going to be basically programmed to sort of act certain ways. But God could create a universe with randomness that evolves according to its own randomness, and with that it churns out unique souls or unique beings that are not determined by God. Now, within that sort of process, you avoid God determining everything, but you also have to deal with randomness and chaos. So yeah, it would fit perfectly fine with a specific Christian worldview. I wouldn't really address the main argument I'm trying to address tonight, which would be that we could still have the existence of a mind with that kind of thing. You did mention one thing I wanted to address. You mentioned there's some planets that serve no purpose. Well, I would argue the universe is still very young. I mean, scientists would say the universe is probably going to exist for a googolplex, which is 10 to the 10 to the 100th power. The universe is only like 14.6 billion years old or so. If Christianity is true, we would argue that what's going to happen within a couple thousand years is the resurrection would occur, and then it'd be our job to turn the universe into Eden. So yeah, there's no life on those planets now, but even deist Paul Davies says there's no life there yet. Maybe eventually as humans grow and we develop in our technology, we will spread life to those types of planets. So I'm not really seeing how randomness will really address the existence of a God. You could still have a God with a randomness. We would expect on a Christian worldview there to be randomness in the universe, so God is not determining everything, and the universe can churn out its own unique souls. So with regards to the next one, you said that some gods sort of explain. We've sort of explained gods away over time, and so I would first of all argue that we explain away natural ideas of gods, not creator forms of gods. Those arguments, moral contingency, teleological arguments, have been around for thousands of years, and they've only been updated. They've never been explained away. They've only just been strengthened, especially with the new knowledge we've been able to find. And yes, there's a lot of new knowledge I've used, but there's always going to be new knowledge. We should always be going on the most up-to-date knowledge. What, should I go on knowledge from 100 years ago? I'd prefer to go on what the most up-to-date data is. If that changes, then we'll change our inferences at that point. The same thing we do with like theory of evolution, quantum gravity. We go on the best up-to-date data. So again, standard arguments have been around. They have not been done away with. What has been debunked is the idea of natural gods. And yeah, there are different explanations in various different religions, but the same thing is with science. There's various different theories on evolution. There's different paradigms, structuralism versus functionalism, and then various different aspects with regards to in that. So you said people believe what they want to believe. Religion is sort of comforting. Well, I think we need to distinguish between the psychological reasons and the metaphysical reasons. Both could be true. A religion could be comforting and helpful because God imbued it to be that kind of way, to actually sort of help. The psychological reasons why people believe are also not going to touch the metaphysical questions of if God exists or which religion is true. Both could be true. You mentioned Andrew Newberg, who's doing those experiments. Well, I have his book right here, Why God Won't Go Away. It's a great book. I read about his experiments, but him and his co-researcher argue in the book that this is actually evidence for something beyond the material. They're trying to say that, no, this is actually good evidence to support that. And they use a good analogy. They say, if you were to, you could mess with my brain and you could make it do as I was seeing a bird just by playing with certain things in the brain. Well, that doesn't mean I don't ever see birds in reality. Just because there is neuroscientific chemicals and reactions going off, that doesn't mean that everything beyond what we see is an illusion. So just because there's a part of the brain that could explain where spiritual experiences come from, that doesn't mean there cannot be a spiritual reality. They argue that a god or a spiritual entities could make those in humans on purpose, so they would have a way to interact with us or to send messages, so to speak, in that sense. So it's a very interesting book what they go into. They're not actually arguing this explains away religion. They're arguing this actually supports the idea of there being a spiritual reality. So we need to distinguish between psychology, neuroscience, and the metaphysical truth of something. So, example, how we come to learn about science is through our own psychology, but that's not what science actually is. I don't think you'd be a subjectivist or an anti-realist when it comes to science. We would say that just because that's how we come to learn something, that is not the metaphysical or ontological nature of something. So all of the things you mentioned could very well just be true. We could have a random universe that is imbued with chaos to allow for the universe to turn out unique souls that are not determined by God. You could have you could also have the psychology that explains religion along with the metaphysics that point to a religious worldview. Those two things would not necessarily contradict, just like the psychology of how we learn science is not the same as what science necessarily is. So back to my main point, though, I'll wrap up with this, is that when it comes to the existence of God, this is more of an ontological or metaphysical question. Just because we can explain how humans think or come to accept things in terms of psychology, that's not really going to explain away the metaphysical question. Those can be entirely compatible. For example, I just had a debate with Michael Shermer where we were arguing that religion was beneficial. And I argue that religion can be beneficial in many, many ways. But just because it's beneficial and makes people give themselves a sense of purpose and whatnot, that doesn't mean it's entirely false. People can find purpose in all sorts of things. People can find purpose in their work. A scientist can find purpose in his work as a scientist, but that doesn't mean that what he's studying, that's all that science is. That's all that it is. There's really an ontological nature beyond that good feeling he gets from his work of studying science. So yeah, with regards to that, I think, of course, the main objection that you presented, you spent the most time on, of course, is the randomness one, the idea that the universe seems chaotic and whatnot. But I mean, again, on a Christian worldview, specifically, well, let's start with a deistic worldview. I mean, I don't see how that would necessarily debunk the existence of God, because you could have a deistic God. So I'd like for you to, if you have time, to address that in your rebuttal, somehow would address. Cameron?
We were frozen. I think we're back.
Yeah, I'm back. Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah. So with regards to a Christian worldview, again, the idea behind it is that Josh Rasmussen and Jordan Wesson lay out. It's like you have two options here. God could determine everything like 6,000 years ago with certain natures, or he could allow a random chaotic type universe to turn out unique souls that would be truly free and not determined by him, and then can choose to come to accept him or whatnot. This is the prequel for a video I am working on in June on the problem of suffering, or I'll present ideas like I'm working on like the law of triumph to explain suffering and evil in that sense. So yeah, that should with the rest, I guess I can yield back the rest of my time. I feel like I've addressed most of everything, but I would like to hear, if you have time, to cover maybe some of the arguments I presented, or you can just reply to that, whatever you feel is best.
All right, yeah, sorry about that. We actually had like a little technical freeze or glitch. I don't know what happened, but we are back. So let's go ahead and move into AP's first rebuttal, which again is 10 minutes. Let me go ahead and pull it up on the screen here, and I'm going to set the timer for 10 minutes, and then just let me know when you're ready. So I can't hear you. Did you mute yourself? Yeah, it looks like you muted yourself.
Yes, I did. I'm a genius. I just unmuted myself. I'm ready.
All right, I'll start the timer now.
Okay, fantastic. So thank you, Michael, for all that. I will first take some time to respond to your main arguments in your opening. I don't know if it will take 10 minutes. I would like to keep the response to your recent to your recent objections to later. I don't know how this will work out, but so if we get back to your major arguments that you presented in your opening, your first point was that if the universe or if space is emergent, then it must be emergent from a mind, and if it's emergent from a mind, then it must be then God exists. I believe that is how it goes. So if the universe is emergent, that it emerges from a mind, and since it emerges from a mind, it must be from God, who is the mind behind all of this. I believe your second argument, you are free to briefly correct me on that if you think I've miscommunicated that. I believe your second argument is basically a variation of the cosmic consciousness argument. You have argued that that material reality is that we have consciousness, that we perceive things as they are. Without consciousness, they are entirely meaningless. Consciousness on its own cannot exist, cannot come from material. Consciousness must come from consciousness, must have an origin, which is why God exists. I remember William Lane Craig also extensively explaining this in quite a different way. But if I want to respond to your first argument, I would like to say that while we have used a lot of scientific language, a lot of scientific exploration, we basically just see, as far as I understand it, as far as I can observe it, that space did emerge. Yes, this is a very popular thought and assumption, theory in science that many scientists have come to. But the whole argument that it must be emergent from a mind, it doesn't really follow from that argument. The conclusion doesn't really follow. I mean, we can say that if we look at space, if we look at how things work, it is similar to neural pathways. It is similar to a human brain. It is similar to the mind. But first off, we cannot really address it as similar. The brain is still something that neuroscience is not really very much advanced on. That neuroscience is very much at the beginning of. But even if the mind, the neural pathways, even if our nervous system, even if our entire body, even if everything was similar to space, was similar to the universe, even if everything was entirely similar, almost a copy of each other in terms of how they work and how they are wired and operate, that would not mean that there is a mind, a designer behind this. That seems to be simply a conclusion that we willfully make because that's what we want to conclude. I simply do not see why we would ever arrive at such a conclusion. Of course, for example, I could go ahead and say, yeah, I agree. The universe is similar to neural pathways. I agree that the universe looks like a mind. It looks like how a mind operates, but that doesn't really mean that there is a designer behind it. It could simply mean that this is how things work. This is how things go. This is how life evolves. This is how things emerge. This is how they come into existence. I mean, to that, we can conclude that space is emergent, that things have begun from a certain at a certain place, from a certain spot. But we are not even entirely sure about how things emerged, how space emerged, where it comes from, what happened before that, why it emerged. These are all questions that are open, that scientists don't have a proper consensus on. There are even still views around that contest the entire story of the Big Bang, for example. While those are minority opinions and are nowadays considered dismissed and very weak, they are still around. And science, as always, leaves the possibility open that we might have completely misunderstood the Big Bang, that we might have completely misunderstood the development of the universe so far. So while I do not believe that science can offer us a reasonable answer on the whole God question, I also do not believe that we are in any position at any space to really refer to science to come to a profound, detailed conclusion that God does or does not exist. What we have are some answers to some questions that arose only 100 years ago, and all we can do is simply research, develop, observe further. And we have a term called the observable universe because we only see so far. We don't see much beyond. We have only assumptions, scientific theories, scientific consensus on matters. So while there is so much more for us to observe and to find out, I see a great disconnection in the argument. The space emerged, therefore it must come from a mind, therefore it comes from God. I don't see these 3 points connecting to each other at all. While I think that the science is insignificant and insufficient in all this. Coming to the cosmic consciousness argument, this argument historically is based on the idea that Consciousness cannot exist on its own. Consciousness cannot emerge on its own. And since consciousness exists, it must have been designed and created, and that whatever designed and created it must be bigger and stronger than this consciousness, which is why God exists. Your argument borders on certain assumptions that, for example, wetness is something that has no meaning on its own, but it only has meaning because it is it means something to us. It is subjective. We feel it. We observe things. We feel certain things. We perceive certain things when we look at colors. I would say that would be a very bad conclusion unless I really unless I terribly misunderstood something there, because wetness is something that completely affects us physically and simply sends signals through our body which have a physical impact on us, which is why we perceive it. Pain is something that we feel because it has a physical impact on us and our body sends us signals, which is why we perceive it. Color is something that establishes a pattern and stimulates our brain, our mind, which is why we perceive it, which is why we have preferences regarding colors. Patterns in the universe, patterns in nature exist, and evolution simply explains patterns very often by explaining that humans and other animals look for patterns in nature in order to feel familiarity and safety, which is why we recognize these patterns. They mean something to us naturally, psychologically, neuroscientifically, which is science. Even when we come to things like, hunger is a very basic thing. We feel it because our body needs it and it sends us our signal. And that is very similar to wetness or pain. We feel love because it sends us the signals and gives us the feeling of safety, of reproduction, which is why we feel connected to each other and perceive that. We see in neuroscience, as far as it has developed so far, that all of our feelings, all of our emotions, all of our consciousness is a result of, so far, I'm saying, I said we are very far behind when it comes to neuroscience, but so far we see that everything is material, everything is observable. Dreams are, we can track dreams in the brain, we can track certain mental states, mental illnesses in the brain, we can track meditation, focus, love, everything in the brain. We can observe that the neurotransmitters that we have on in our brain, or in our nervous system, bring us to certain actions and conclusions, to certain feelings and perceptions. We see that everything is simply material, comes out of material availability. There is no reason for us to assume that we think that we have consciousness because it comes from somewhere else, or that this couldn't have simply developed due to the surrounding circumstances. There is no reason for us to assume that there must be a big designer behind all of this. That would be simply a slippery slope. I understand why people want to conclude that, but there is no reason to conclude that and to use that as an evidence in any way. Finally, food for thought is a simple experiment where two individuals, Mary and John, ride on a motorbike and have an accident. Mary has a surviving body while John has a surviving head. In order to save one of these people, at least, people transplant John's head onto Mary's body. Who survives is John in Mary's body because John's brain survived, which means the brain is completely material. That is all I want to say.
Let's move into, let's just get right back into it. So we're moving right now into the 10-minute cross-examine period. And this is one of my pet peeves about cross-examination periods, is that most of the time they don't actually end up being a cross-examination. It's more just like a kind of open dialogue between the two people. So I want to really, as a moderator, I want to make sure that as we move into this section, the person who is asking the questions, that is all that they do. They only ask questions. We're going to start with Michael, and he's going to ask questions for 10 minutes, and then we'll move over to AP, and AP will ask Michael questions for 10 minutes, and then we'll move into closings and then some Q&A, as I said. So I'm actually going to start the timer on my phone. I'm going to leave it on this screen for everyone to watch. And then, so Michael, whenever you start, I will start my timer.
Okay, so yeah, I'm just going to try my best to ask questions here. So my first question is you mentioned neuroscientific evidence points to the brain creating consciousness. Is there any studies you can refer that show that? Because I've been looking into that extensively and I've not found any.
You mean regarding the idea that neuroscience explains that consciousness depends on the brain?
Yeah, are there studies that show that how the brain would create consciousness and are not just arguing from neural correlates?
I don't think that there are studies that would prove and conclude that that consciousness can be created by the brain. I think we are not far enough to get to such a conclusion. But there are only studies that conclude that consciousness depends on the brain in its current state. Well, its development is a different issue. I would not be able to.
Do you think the brain creates consciousness?
I do not know. It could be.
But didn't you say in your opening statement that the most likely explanation is consciousness comes from the brain?
Well, it could be. I mean, this is an option that I would consider. I would think logically that matter can create consciousness.
So
Consciousness can develop within matter is what I
So
could think or believe, but I couldn't. I wouldn't say, yeah, that is what I believe.
okay, so then what do you believe about consciousness? Because it sounded like you were saying that you believe consciousness comes from matter, and so I'm confused now.
No, I would say that is the more likely explanation. I just
Okay,
don't
then I
want
gotta.
to say this is what I believe. Yeah.
So you admit that. So basically, you admit that we don't have enough evidence to show it, but you think it's the most likely explanation. But when
Yeah,
it comes to
yeah.
the evidence for God, you don't think we have enough there yet to and make that inference. So what's the difference? Why don't we have enough evidence to infer an existence of a God based on the most up-to-date data, but you think we have enough evidence to that the most likely explanation is the brain or matter can create consciousness?
Nice question. Well, I believe that we have enough reason to assume, as said, not to believe, but to assume in the current state that that a brain, that matter can create consciousness, that consciousness can come forth as a natural result, than to believe that it comes from a divine origin, because we have supporting evidence that consciousness exists and depends currently on matter, on the brain itself, for example. We have
So we can make inferences from limited data.
yeah, well, we have. I would say it is. I would say it is more reasonable to assume this when you want to compare this to explaining God by without having enough evidence. I would say that would be a very absurd thing to do, because we have not ever in history found that anything has ever come from a supernatural divine origin, which is why it would be absurd to claim that there is a big giant creator behind everything.
What do you mean by find? Like, how would we find something? Are you talking empirically? Because that would be a category error.
Well, I would say that in history, as explained in my opening, in history we have attempted to explain natural phenomena by crediting a certain divine supernatural origin for it, but it never turned out to be that. Everything always turned out to be in a completely natural flow. So it is absurd to assume that behind everything there still is some God, and that this is the most likely option.
Isn't that kind of like a naturalism of the gaps, where you're just assuming a natural explanation for these other arguments, even though there's no evidence that points to it?
No, I would simply say this is the most neutral position. It would be more understandable to simply say we need to find out what this is, rather than to say, well, it must be God.
So, but if we're going to find out what it is, we can make inferences based on the best available data, like you're doing with matter and consciousness, right?
Sure.
We can still make
Sure, we
inferences
could.
to what the best explanation is.
Sure.
So, would you believe in evolution, correct?
I trust the current science. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. I'm not challenging evolution. So you believe in evolution. The fact that evolution could be overturned in 50 years, does that mean there's no reason to make the inference now?
No, I would say that in science it is completely understandable and expected that certain things about evolution will probably change within 50 years, or the whole notion might be completely changed. That is a possibility, yes.
But based on the data now,
But
we're not going to just not worry about that. We're just going to follow the data where it leads currently.
well, we are going to rely on what we know by now, based on the scientific evidence that we have.
Right. So why wouldn't the same type of model or methodology apply with God's existence? If the evidence
Be-
implies a God, why wouldn't we make that inference?
because we don't have any evidence that implies anything related to God. We have much evidence that that points toward natural things. We don't have any evidence toward God at all. We never had any evidence.
Okay, well, what would qualify as evidence then?
To be very blunt, what would qualify to me as evidence is if we saw that things suddenly appeared out of nowhere, out of thin air, literally, or that a giant being came down from the sky and said, "Hello, I am God. This is God." Or if we all saw things that if we all saw magical, weird things that nobody can explain in any proper way. That would be evidence for God, for example. But we have natural explanations for everything. Nothing magical has ever happened.
I mean, wouldn't that be evidence of a miracle, not necessarily God? Those are two different things.
No, I don't think that would be. I mean, you could call it a miracle, but what really is a miracle and what really is natural, what really is supernatural? I think the distinction between supernatural and natural is pretty clear. Natural is something that can be very clearly observed and explained in regular, normal, natural causes and effects, whereas something supernatural would be something that clearly proves that some greater power is at work, which we cannot explain by any regular natural activities and observations, cause and effect. Such a thing does not exist. Whether you call it miracle or supernatural is a different story.
Okay, well, don't we know from quantum field theory that virtual particles pop in and out of existence from nothing? So wouldn't that be what you were thinking of? I mean, things popping in and out of existence.
I would not qualify myself as somebody who is qualified to discuss that matter deeply. But as far as I understand it, that is not.
Let me change it then. Let me change it then. So a lot of physicists believe the Big Bang it caused itself. Would that? I mean, so if things are coming into existence on their own, wouldn't that not necessarily be evidence for God? That could be evidence for that weird physical view that things pop into existence from nothing.
Could be. We could assume that maybe there was some mind.
How would that be evidence for God then? If there's another explanation that physicists are already proposing that could align with that?
No, I don't think that could be evidence for anything. I would say that you could always leave the possibility open that behind all of that, which we do not understand, there must be some originator. But just because we don't understand something, just because we cannot explain something, just because we don't know how exactly the Big Bang happened and why it happened, it would be absurd to engage in this fallacy and say, well, it must have come from a divine originator. We do not know how and where it came from. We can't make conclusions based on that as of yet.
Okay, so what it sounds like, correct? I need to clarify. So it sounds like what you're saying, if earlier you said if things were coming into existence from nothing, that'd be evidence of God. But the Big Bang coming on its own from nothing is not evidence for God.
We don't have any evidence that everything came out of nothing. We only have conclusions so far that the Big Bang happened. The idea that everything came out of nothing is not a scientifically consensually agreed notion at the moment.
Correct. I'm just using it as an analogy to sort of try to get home at this. So back to the main point. I mean, could a young Earth creationist use very similar methodology and say that, well, unless you can show me evolution happening in front of my eyes, I'm not going to believe in it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it sounds like it's setting an unreasonable standard that cannot be met and not actually following the current data where it leads.
Well, I would think that is a very false comparison. It's a false equivalence. We can observe many aspects of evolution. We can provide proof. We can provide, fossil records. We can provide a lot of natural evidence that points at evolution happening. And as science works, you know how science works. This is a scientific theory. We explain why evolution is happening based on many scientific findings and a scientific consensus that agrees to this. We have over 500,000 papers that support evolution, for example.
So we infer based on the data, right? We can infer based on it, even though we can't witness it in front of our eyes.
Based on evidence, yes.
Okay, so wouldn't my arguments be similar? I'm making inferences based on the best available data.
I have 15 seconds.
I don't think it's comparable because
do you have a better explanation for the data I presented other than it should just be a brute fact?
Well, I think I don't think it is logically conclusive. I don't have an explanation for it.
Is evolution logically conclusive? Like, is it absolutely provable?
All right. Sorry, that is.
I wouldn't say absolutely. I would say consensually agreed.
All right, that's time. Let's move into AP's cross-examination period. So again, try to stick to questions as best you can. I noticed that Michael was kind of catching himself every now and then. He's like, okay, wait, I gotta ask this as a question.
I'm trying.
So
Try my best.
Do your best, and I'll jump in if I need to and help clarify. All right, whenever you ask your first question, I'll start my timer.
Okay, to be honest, I'm not very great at asking questions. I didn't really prepare for the whole question asking session, but I will try to do my best to get into that. But let us start with this. Michael, do you believe that it is scientifically possible, as far as we see now, that humans will, in a near future, develop well enough to make use of our surrounding planets and give them some meaning within all the meaninglessness?
I think it's possible. Yeah, I think terraforming Mars will probably happen in at least my grand's lifetime. But I mean, it's speculation, so it's possible.
Isn't it the current understanding that certain objects, certain planets can never be terraformed, or that we will never reach this technology within the next thousands, hundreds, millions of years?
Well, I mean, for gas giants, sure. I mean, but there is a lot of interesting speculation on how to terraform Venus, Mars, even Mercury, the moons around Jupiter. So yeah, there's definitely going to be some planets we probably could never terraform, like a gas giant, I would say.
Why do you think? What do you think would be the explanation for if we say we see numerous planets and objects around us that have absolutely no meaning and no purpose? Why do you think all of these would exist in a universe that was designed by an intelligent creator who gives a lot of importance to us?
Well, if we're talking about an intelligent theistic type worldview where there is where mental is the foundation of reality, we have to acknowledge there's more than just pragmatism at play. There could be aesthetics. Things can be created for the glory of God or because they are beautiful and pleasing. Jupiter plays an important role with our existence in keeping meteors from hitting the inner planets like Earth, for example. It has a strong gravitational pull there. Mm-hmm. So just because we may not see it at purpose necessarily, that doesn't necessarily mean there is no overall purpose just because we haven't found one. There could very well be one, and even if it's not, I think Jupiter is pretty aesthetically pleasing to look at and beautiful. I want to see a beautiful universe.
Do you agree with the scientific conclusion at the moment that the universe is about 13.7 or 8 billion years old?
Yeah, I agree with the standard science. I'm not a young Earth creationist.
Okay. Do you think it appears meaningful that we as humans on this planet have a certain meaning, have a certain ambition, a certain purpose to believe in a creator, but everything simply existed for 14 billion years without us ever being in existence?
Well, I would argue that, for example, that there has been life before us, and I would say that life proclaims the glory of God. It's not just human life. I would say all of life. And also, I would point out that God is not really bound by time, so that 14.6 billion years was not really like him waiting around for humans to show up. It wasn't necessarily meaningless. It's just a backstory.
I agree it wouldn't be very significant to God, but it would be significant to us, right? I mean, if we stand here and want to discuss whether God exists or not, it would be quite confusing for the contemporary human to look back at history, at dinosaurs and the age of the universe, and conclude that God exists and there was a plan behind all of this. Don't you agree?
Well, I think we need to differentiate between value and size and time length. I would say that a child that unfortunately dies young is still more valuable than a rock that's been here for 4 billion years. Time span does not determine value, just like size doesn't determine value.
Okay, I understand. Sorry, I don't know where to go with my questions right now.
Yes, it is real. If that's your next question, I've worked hard on it.
Yeah, I shouldn't.
Take your time.
Yeah, I prepared for everything except the question asking session.
Hey, if you'd like, we could just move into open dialogue for the next 6 minutes.
Sure, we could do that if that's okay with you.
Okay. Yeah.
Go for it.
So you talked about, as said, I kind of addressed your issue with the whole idea that that our consciousness or subjective experiences prove that there must be a big that there must be some designer behind all of this, that there must be a creator behind all of this. But don't you agree that our functions, our perceptions, the meaning that we give things are there for a reason, that they have all natural and physical functions?
Well, there's no evidence that consciousness is just created by the brain or has those types of things. So I'm not really sure what you mean by that. Could you kind of clarify?
Yeah, but I mean, you gave wetness for an example, and I kind of responded to that. Then we can go on to colors and pain and all of that. We see that all of
Well,
these things are natural functions that we have.
that was my challenge, though, is that they weren't physical. These are mental properties. I mean, so wetness doesn't exist in nature. Wetness is what happens when a mind comes in contact with water. So this goes back to the idea of bundle theory. What you're really experiencing is not a physical world. You're experiencing bundles of properties that can be just reduced to just mental phenomena. So the basis is an idealistic worldview.
Of course, but for example, when we come to pain, I think pain is a very significant discussion to have, or even wetness. There are people that have certain disorders, that are born with certain disabilities, who are incapable of feeling pain or incapable of perceiving wetness, for example. We see in those people that when they are significantly hurt, when they are being stabbed or cut in very brutal ways, they do not experience pain because they are incapable of it, because their body does not work the way it is supposed to work. We see from there that that pain is something which our body simply feels, which our nervous system sends signals through our body to indicate that we are being cut, we are being harmed, which is why we feel pain and we are alerted and we do something about it.
Yeah.
In some
So
people,
I just wrote a term paper on this. Basically, what you could argue is analogous is that they don't have the right software installed. So I mean, like, someone can be born colorblind. They're not going to be able to experience the information of colors. I mean, that doesn't mean it's physical. It just means they don't have the right way to experience it. Brain damage doesn't really, hurt idealism. Physical defects doesn't hurt idealism, because analogous, it would just be the same as not having the right software loaded up into it. So yeah, I could play a video game, and let's say I play with a black and white monitor. Okay, well, there are certain phenomenal states of that video game I can't experience now because I have a black and white monitor, even though they're currently there. I don't have the right way to experience it because of a defect of somewhere in there.
Well, but it seems absurd to me to conclude that, given that these are all mostly sensations, feelings that have to do with our natural existence, with our instincts, with our survivalism, with natural functions, to assume that all this goes back to some divine originator. I mean, even if wetness is not really a thing, even if wetness is not tangible, even if wetness is subjective, all it does is to indicate to us the presence of something physical that is happening.
Right. I'm not arguing the mental properties are therefore God. I'm saying mental properties, therefore idealism. Idealism implies consciousness is fundamental. Consciousness is fundamental would come from a fundamental source. It would be created by the material. There's a little more like steps in there. I'm not saying mental properties therefore God.
If we simplify that, we would say that
consciousness. My argument is from consciousness, and to help argue consciousness is fundamental, I use bundle theory.
So to simplify that, correct me. We argue that consciousness exists, which is why we perceive things as they are, with things that do not actually exist, things that are not tangible, and this consciousness must have an originator. It is designed, which means it comes from an
well, I
originator.
I didn't use the word designed on purpose. I meant more like a foundational. I mean, J.P. Moreland uses the same type of reasoning. If consciousness is not created by the brain, well, we come into existence. So where did us as conscious minds comes from?
So
the argument would be
so what
it comes from a conscious source.
Sorry. So what we're doing is basically to say, well, we do not explain how it can emerge within nature, therefore God.
Well, no, the actual arguments for consciousness, I didn't have time to get in. There's specific arguments that argue that it could not emerge from the brain. It's just completely illogical. This is the basis of the hard problem, and things like indivisibility of consciousness, perceptions. It's just the argument is that consciousness, as it ontologically is understood, could not be physical.
but consciousness is indicated to be physical at the
How?
current state.
Where? What is the evidence of that?
Well, our brain creates sorry, I used the wrong word, not creates. Our brain makes consciousness function. Our brain is a motherboard. If the brain is removed, then your consciousness is gone. You can replace every organ that you have. You cannot replace the brain. The brain is you. As in the example I have given, if two people die and one person has a surviving body, the other person has a surviving head, including brain, then you can translate you could, hypothetically, we don't have the technology yet, but you could place the functioning head and brain onto the functioning body, and the person who is then alive would be the person brain and head you saved, which means consciousness completely depends on the brain, isn't it?
Sorry, that's actually time. So if you guys don't mind, let's move into closings, and then we'll do some Q&A, and then in between, maybe be able to touch back on some of the things that we were just talking about there. Okay. But all right, let's move into closing. So IP, Michael is going to be first. Let me go ahead and pull up his main screen, reset the timer for 5 minutes, and then whenever you're ready, Michael, go ahead and start.
Yeah, I don't have much to say in the close, so I'm going to respond to that. That is based on correlation, not causation. For example, I could have an avatar in a video game, and if you remove the avatar, like I die or something, that doesn't mean that's all that I was. It just means my gateway into that world has been cut off. Killing someone, removing it from the brain does not necessarily mean that consciousness creates the brain. These are correlations, not causations. And you can check out my series, Irreducible Mind. It's 5 parts. I'm going to have another part coming out soon, hopefully, later this year. And I have a whole section on there on one video is on the afterlife, near-death experiences, and examples of consciousness without brains and all these sorts of disorders like hydroencephalus. There was a kid born without a brain who was still conscious. All these various examples that have been medically confirmed. So you can have consciousness without a brain, and that's what I was going to get into. I just didn't have the time. But getting back to the main argument with the consciousness argument, the argument once again is that because there is no explanation that consciousness can come from the brain, and all the evidence points to the idea that consciousness is irreducible. For example, you can't divide your conscious experience. You can only divide your memories. You can divide the information processing conscious, but you can't divide consciousness. It would be fundamental. And if that's the case, using J.P. Moreland's same reasoning, it would come from a fundamental source, namely God. AP mentioned a couple times in debate, he didn't really see the reasoning of how my arguments went to God's existence. But once again, he agreed the universe was emergent. So he just has a problem with the first premise. If the universe is emergent, it's emergent from a mind. Once again, let me remind AP and everyone else how we get to God from there. So the universe is emergent. What does it emerge from? Well, the underlying quantum realm. Well, again, quantum cognition shows the properties of the mind can be modeled using quantum mechanics. So the underlying quantum realm is very similar to how we think and how minds operate. It looks like it emerges from a mind. And so that can be supported philosophically as well from traditional theistic contingency arguments. But also the work of Felitti and Vaza also point out that the image of the universe is very similar to the way the brain kind of looks. Both could be the result of a mind. That would support that notion. So the way the logical inference works is people go, well, what caused the universe? What is the universe emergent from? How do you know it's a God? Well, we can study that. We can study the underlying quantum world, and we can look at it and see it looks very similar to how the properties of the mind work. That implies what's underneath there is, in fact, a mind. That is the best, most up-to-date logical inference. Just like we make the inference to evolution from the data, even though we can't observe macroevolution on large scales, we can do the same thing with God's existence. The evidence points to that. And of course, there are all sorts of other arguments I have not had time to get in. What you'll get with an atheist like this is when I present argument from consciousness, contingency arguments, moral arguments, you'll get different explanations. Sometimes you'll get things like brute facts, like AP presented in his rebuttal. It just is that way. It looks that way. Okay, but that's not really an explanation. It doesn't really get us anywhere. When theists present the various arguments for God's existence, you'll get, well, maybe morality is this, and it's not foundation. Foundation isn't God. The contingency argument maybe could be explained with other these possibilities. We could take the argument from consciousness and try to explain it this way. Problem. What you're doing is you're multiplying assumptions or entities beyond necessity. The atheistic reply to the arguments from theism is to find all these various different possibilities to try to counter the theistic argument. Whereas a theist can answer all of this with one explanation, namely a mind created the universe. And that is far more parsimonious and a much better explanation because I'm able to explain all of this with far less. It meets the criteria of plausibility on that. So theism is able to account for all this data with much less. On an atheistic worldview, you're going to just get things like, well, it just is that way. That's just the way the universe is. It's a brute fact. We don't have enough data to infer beyond that. But then they'll make inferences to consciousness based on very limited data. So it's okay to infer physicalist explanations, but not okay to infer theistic explanations, even though it would be the exact same methodology. And I would argue the evidence for God is far better off than the idea that the universe, or the idea that the brain creates consciousness. There is so much data against this. I don't have time to get into it. Check out my Irreducible Mind series. Part 1 is neuroscientific evidence. Part 2 is the hard problem. Part 3 is refuting a lot of arguments from physicalism. Part 4 is quantum biology. And part 5 is near-death experiences. So I cover a lot of that more in detail. I just won't have time to get to it now.
All right. It sounds like, Michael, you're going to concede the rest of your time. So we'll move into closing statement from AP. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're just joining us, we're about to head to a 30-minute Q&A session. And a lot of you have already sent in super chats. We'll get to as many as we can. I actually won't be able to pull them up on my software because of the technical glitch that happened earlier. So I'll try to get to them regardless, though, even if I can't pull them on the screen. All right, let's go into AP, your closing statement. Let me actually pull your screen up and adjust your timer so that you've got 5 minutes. And whenever you start talking, I'll start the timer.
Okay. Well, thanks again, as always. I would finally say a few things about the whole consciousness issue again. Again, one of the assumptions that we make here, which is why we come to the conclusion that God exists, or that a mind exists behind our mind, is that we cannot explain consciousness to be originating from a material physical place, and therefore we assume that God exists, which I would say, I mean, of course, the whole argument is longer, but that is basically the conclusion that we arrive at. We can, as said, prove nowadays that consciousness depends on material. Consciousness depends on the brain. Consciousness depends on our organ, on a brain that we have. As said, again, to reiterate the example that I have given, this was actually one of the most profound examples that you learn when you study psychology or neuroscience, is that if Mary and John get into an accident and Mary's body survives and John's head survives, then if you transplanted John's head onto Mary's body, the person who then survives as a result of this accident would be John, because it is John's head on Mary's body. Despite all the organs and the entire body that Mary has left behind, it is John's head which survives, where the brain sits, which would mean that the person that remains and survives is John, which simply proves that consciousness, that your mind is dependent on your brain. It sits right there. Of course, certain places in your body, due to your nervous system, influence how your brain works, how your mind works, how you feel things, your anxieties and all that. But that's all simply detail. Consciousness is the brain, as much as we know. For the moment, it would be absurd to conclude that we cannot explain consciousness, and we cannot explain how consciousness comes into existence, therefore God. This would mean basically that this would be a God of the gaps argument, where we cannot explain something and we then credit God for it. When we come to psychology, as said, we find psychologically seen that humans simply find comfort in worship and in prayer. I do find comfort. I went out recently, looked at the sky, looked at a tree, and I felt a sense of humility and felt like it was a very good feeling, a brilliant feeling. But Buddhists, when they sit down and meditate without worshiping anything, feel that same feeling. People who meditate, people who do yoga, people who engage in humility and love feel that same feeling. It is all a religious experience which we feel based on necessities of our mental state during the day. It does not in any way lead us to God. All it shows us is that we want to believe, we want to take our attention from ourselves, we want to take our burden, put it on something else, we want to have some religious experience, and we leave religion in the past and will in the future focus on more productive methods to do that. As said, my approach there in talking about that was not to prove that God does not exist. It was simply to present a perspective, to explain why God probably does not exist and why we would like to think that God exists. Finally, the argument that the space is like the mind and therefore there must be a mind behind it, and therefore there must be God behind it. I still think this entire argument is, if we simplify it, inconclusive. It doesn't lead to the conclusion that that Mike wants to get us to. It doesn't conclude that the universe must have been created by a mind, must have originated from a mind, and that therefore God exists. I do not believe that such an approach, such a conclusion would be reasonable. All we see is that there are certain patterns in the universe. Mainly, as I stated from the very beginning, mainly we are surrounded by disorder and chaos everywhere. And just because there are some patterns in the world, that doesn't mean that there is an originator, a mind behind everything. Finally, I think one point that I brought up that we have overlooked and skipped many times is that in human history, and nowadays too, we have tried to interpret and try to credit God or gods or supernatural origins for so many things in human history, and 100% of those turned out to be wrong. If 100 out of 100 assumptions turn out to be wrong, then it would be absurd to go on and still stick to that. There is no reason to believe, not even in a deistic model. There is simply no reason to believe in God.
All right, with that, we're going to turn to some Q&A. So as I mentioned, we've already had a bunch of super chats come in. Before I get to the first one, I wanted to let you know, if you haven't already subscribed to this channel and you're interested in this kind of thing, like discussions between Christians and non-Christians, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. I think you'll like the content that we put out. Also, head over to the channels of the two gentlemen that I've got today, AP, Apostate Prophet. He's linked in the description, and then also Inspiring Philosophy. But Inspiring Philosophy is actually at 175,000 subscribers right now, which is really awesome. And AP is at 254,000. I looked at their numbers right before we started. So congrats, guys, on these numbers. That's really cool. All right, let's move into the first question. The first question is, and again, I apologize for not being able to pull up on the screen. This one is from Hasieteas Kiditi. I don't know how to say this name. But anyways, thank you for your super chat. I wish I could pull it on the screen. If you had to assign exact numerical probability to the existence of God in light of what you know, what would that probability be? So let's start with you, Michael.
I hate doing that because it's hard to put numbers on it, and I'm very critical of using like Bayes' theorem and arguments for God's existence or historical arguments because there's no quantities you can calculate. I mean, it's very probable, I would say, given all the data and how you can explain so much with it. But I just don't like putting numbers on it because I don't know how to do that kind of thing. I don't know how to transfer into a quantity type situation. I would say it's a quality type argument. So it's just very, very probable in my view, given all the data.
How about you, AP?
Sorry, I was just being a clown in the live chat. Can you repeat the question again?
If you had to assign exact numerical probability to the existence of God in light of what you know, what would that probability be?
How do we do that? Like on a scale or on a percentage?
That's what I said.
What do we do?
Yeah, you could try to do like a percentage. You could also do it in like your credence level. Like I'm 60% sure
at the moment, I would say there is 0% chance for God.
All right, here's the next question from AKA Blake Stone. IP, in dreams, when people create mind spaces with internal mental physics, is this illustrative of your first point, mind making mind worlds / spaces?
Yeah, it has been used to support bundle theory, the idea the mind can sort of just make its own properties, so to speak, these sort of physical type realities kind of thing. This is a argument the idealists use, is that matter, physical, is very easily reducible to mental properties. It's much harder to get it the other way around, which is why you have the hard problem of consciousness. It's a hard problem, but it's actually quite simple, given bundle theory, to reduce physical to the mental. And dreams are another good support of that.
So, all right, here's the next question from John Good. He says, are Neanderthals also going to be in heaven? And this is for you, Michael.
Good question. I'm going to be doing a video in June on suffering, and also animal suffering will be addressed in there. I would say yes. It takes a lot more to unpack that, though, because my view is that is the same as Trent Doherty's in his book on animal pain, which is that all souls can experience soul building and move on into an afterlife if they so please. So, yeah, it's going to take a while to unpack that, though, but I'm not, there's a lot going on there. And so for the time being, I'd recommend Trent Doherty's book on the problem of animal suffering.
I also highly recommend that book. It's great. All right, so here
I think Neanderthals
now.
should go to hell. Yeah.
Well, so here's actually I'm going to pull up a super chat from AP. He says it froze because I won. He's talking about when we froze on the screen earlier. It did win. It did freeze because AP is just clearly dominating in this debate.
Broke the screen.
He broke everything. The live chat, the stream, everything just froze. All right, so now we're able to put the questions, the super chats on the screen. The questions from Brian Nicholson. AP, if you don't fear tectonic plates and gravity will disappear with new scientific discovery, why would you take a different approach elsewhere?
If you don't fear tectonic plates and gravity will disappear with new scientific discovery, why would you take a different? I don't understand the question.
I think he's trying to say like, the idea that science could change over time, kind of thing. Like, if you don't fear that, why would you take a different position on, like, I guess God's arguments for existence?
Well, thank you for the question, Brian. I don't think. I mean, I would think that the question of God is one that is of great significance, has greater implications for us. I do not think. I simply don't think that that scientific observations about things like these are comparable to the question of God, which is a completely different issue. It is an existential matter. God is an existential matter. Whereas tectonic plates or gravity are issues that do not really do much for us, explain why things are the way they are. These are simply theories, explanations that could change over time. We could explain why we fall. We could explain why things fall, or why the Earth moves, and all of that. That would be different to explaining whether God exists or not, which is not a why question, but does God exist or does God not exist question. I think there's a big difference there.
All right, let's move on to the next question. And this one is from White Girl with Instagram Black Screen. He or she says, for IP, what's a good argument for an early dating of Daniel and its prophecies?
I don't know. I've not looked into that topic a lot. That's something. I have not gotten there yet.
It's a little off topic as well. But in any case, thank you for your super chat, White Girl with Instagram Black Screen. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through the live chat to pull up the next one. All right, here's from Mickey Assume, and this one is a long one. If third person unconscious events can possibly produce first person conscious events, where is the proportionality? Why then can't water come from fire? What would be the limits? If something can give what one does not have, ...
Yeah,
you can.
I mean, that's an argument for the hard problem. It's the idea that somehow third person experiences and somehow create a first person experience. That's the hard problem itself. How is it that the hard problem, or how is it that consciousness, a first person experience, can come from non-living matter? It is a difficult issue.
It sounds like loud thinking to me. No offense. Thank you, Mike.
Sorry, sounds like what?
But loud thinking, like someone thinking out loud. That's what it sounds like to me. The question here. But I would simply say, I mean, I would stick to what I said earlier. What is appropriate? I mean, I would simply say that the perceptions that we have throughout our life are do not in any way indicate that there is something strange, something inexplicable going on, and that we must therefore infer some greater being or greater meaning behind all of this. All that we have is that a consciousness exists which reacts to, or that we have a nervous system and a consciousness that reacts to things that happen around us naturally, and it is the way things are. It's how nature works. It would be strange to go from there to the idea of God, and yeah.
All right, let's get to another question. And hopefully, if we run, I don't want to say hopefully, but if we do run out of questions, then maybe we can just do some more dialogue until we get closer to the 2-hour mark, which I don't think we're going to run out of questions. From Finding Truth, IP, awesome to see you continue your streak. Love you both. Question for AP, what methods will you use to investigate the existence of God?
Thank you so much for the question. I do not use any methods for it. I think the only methods that we have had during throughout human history were methods of there were phases in which humans tried to use methods of observing the sky, observing the natural world around us, and thereby explaining God or trying to understand and find God. I think the only methods that we have that are reasonable on this pursuit are simply to use the mind and to use psychology. We can make use of pretty much everything, but all we can do is just to sit down and contemplate. And when I do that, I simply, again, as said, do not find any reason to believe in God. I just find more and more reason not to believe in God.
Michael, do you have any thoughts on that?
What methods would we use to investigate the existence of God? I would say the same thing we'd use for other philosophical inferences. My one thing I always try to advocate is that if you're going to study something, the explanation should have explanatory power, explanatory scope. It needs to be the least ad hoc, and it needs to be the most plausible. Now, by the least ad hoc is you need to make the least amount of assumptions involved, and by less plausible, or the most plausible, it would be that you're able to explain multiple areas with one explanation. Well, I would argue God is able to do that with ethics. It can do it with contingency, teleological arguments, consciousness. All the arguments can explain all these various areas of field. And so it's therefore plausible, and it's going to make the least amount of assumptions, and namely there's just one assumption, namely that God exists. So it's far better than a lot of the naturalistic explanations you get for all these various fields. And so I encourage that type of methodology quite often.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would like to say that, as I kind of hinted before during the debate, I would say that the attempt to find God or to discover God, to prove God, to logically explain God, are simply attempts that we have made that are not based on anything, or that are deduced by simply saying we do not understand this cannot be, therefore there must be something behind it. So this is all it seems. That is all the logic that we have. For me, again, the only acceptable way to conclude that there is a God would be to for God, for a divine supernatural being, to have some massive interference into our lives, which everybody can observe, which is objectively observable, and which cannot be argued, which cannot be explained by very simple natural procedures, causes and effects. If a giant hand came down from the sky, I would be like, okay, that could be God.
All right, sorry, let's leave that one there. Moving on to the next question from Kyle Alander. Here's a question to IP. Some may argue that just because our minds are quantum states, that does not mean that all quantum states are mental. What is your response?
Well, I'm not saying the mind is a quantum state. Let's be clear about that. I say the consciousness is fundamental. I'm not saying it is reducible to quantum states. I'd say the mind functions and operates. Quantum cognition shows that how we think and process information would be more akin to quantum mechanics. They use quantum formalism to explain how the mind thinks, how it processes information. It's not saying the mind reduces to a quantum state. So that's, to be clear, I'm not saying quantum states are consciousness. You could say that they are contingent upon a mind, is what the difference would be. So again, it's about difference about how minds operate and act. The argument is that how minds operate and act is very similar to the underlying quantum realm, and so you make the inference and the connection there. So again, it's not saying minds are reduced to quantum states. That'd be more like integrated information theory, which I don't really hold to.
Question from Kieran. Question for IP, another one. Space-time may be emergent, but photon, i.e. sound waves, is really emergent. So does sound also come from mind?
Okay, so once again, there's a difference between the mind and the information the mind processes. Sounds are information that we process in consciousness or in a mind kind of thing. So not saying they necessarily have to come from, individual mind like ours. We would say all is, of course, contingent upon the mind of God there. So yeah, it would technically come from it in that kind of sense. If you're a theist, you think God created everything, indirectly or directly. So indirectly, sound waves would, of course, come back correct to a mind. So we need to make sure we could just clarify kind of what's kind of going here. Yeah, space-time is emergent. Sound waves would be sort of like emergent. They wouldn't be, physical. But that doesn't mean they're coming from individual minds. I'm saying that they're just processed in consciousness, and consciousness It's fundamental. It doesn't reduce to quantum processes or something else emergent.
Do you have anything to add on that, AP?
No, I was just trying to fix my camera so that it looks like I'm sitting higher than Mike. It's just
Okay.
an action of power.
Oh, no,
power
no,
play.
that's on. It's on now. There we go. Keep that.
That's pretty good. All right, Spartan Theology. He says, question for IP. Your argument leads to an abstract mind you call God. What does this have to do with Jesus, a first century crucified Jew, being that God?
Okay, well, first, it doesn't lead to an abstract mind. I wouldn't say that. I would say it leads to an ontological mind. We're arguing in metaphysics. I'm not arguing in epistemology, if that's what you're getting at, or mathematics. So I'd say it leads to an ontological mind. What does it have to do with Jesus? Well, that's a different argument. As I said at the beginning, I'm a classical apologist. I'm going to argue for God exists first, and if you accept that a God can exist, then I can argue for a specific religion. So God is in the background knowledge when you argue for the resurrection kind of thing. So it would be a second additional argument kind of going on. I'm just arguing for God's existence at this point. Arguments for Christianity would be separate and built upon my arguments for God's existence.
So we got a super chat from Apostate Prophet. He said, AP got destroyed. Finished.
Yeah.
You could tell he's really paying attention in this debate.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on. I'm sorry, there's so many comments in this debate so far. It's difficult to actually jump from one to the next one. All right, Epic Christ. He says, Apos, AP. Do you agree that we can prove? God's existence without empirical experience, but merely through philosophical arguments?
I would say in the current state, it could be the only way that you could actually prove or attempt to prove God's existence, but you simply can't.
So it would be through you, but you agree that it would have to be through philosophical arguments. Is that what you're saying?
At the current state, I mean, so far all indications and attempts show that there is simply no other way to prove God's existence, which could mean that philosophical arguments would be the only way to go, the only way to arrive at such a conclusion. But I also do not think, okay, that's a correction here. I also do not think that it's really possible to prove God's existence in that way. At least we have not so far been able to prove it. So no, I don't know.
All right, let's move on to next question. And this one is actually a clarification from the first question that we had from Brian Nicholson. He says, my question was more, if certain features imply God, why would we hold out that those scientific advancements like fine-tuning will be eliminated?
Is that a question for me or for AP?
It's for AP. It's for AP.
Oh, okay.
Like, why would we hold out? Yeah. Why would we hold out hope that science or some kind of natural explanation will be available to us in the future of these different phenomena or data points that Michael was pointing to?
Well, I don't think that anything ever has implied God, or that anything will imply God. I simply do not see such a sign, such a thing happening in human history ever. So I don't understand the assumption here. What I see here is that there have been attempts, very primitive attempts in the past, in the ancient human history, in recent human history, extremely primitive attempts to prove God, to understand the human nature and the nature of our universe, and to credit God for all of it. Then there have been advanced theological arguments and observations. We have recent theological arguments that seem pretty advanced compared to, 1,000 years ago, that go toward proving God's existence, but they all simply fail. You cannot prove it. It is not provable. It all fails at trying to simply explain something, trying to come to a conclusion, which is only a conclusion that relies on belief, which is why it is known as belief. It is always simply belief. There is no proof to it.
So let me actually get this
implications. We cannot rely on implications because we don't have any evidence which would imply such an implication. If we look at science, for example, since we have developed the scientific method, we can see that in science we look at certain evidence. Even if we don't have a final conclusion on a certain matter, we look at the overwhelming evidence which points at a specific thing, and therefore we conclude that this thing must be true, and the scientific consensus comes to that conclusion. When it comes to God, we do not have any evidence whatsoever, only assumptions from the past. So there is simply no reason to expect anything of this in the future.
So this is somewhat related. Maverick Christian asks, what evidence, if any, and this is to you, AP, what evidence, if any, justifies absolute certainty that there is no necessarily existent creator of the universe?
I would say that, as I pointed out at the very beginning of my opening statement, that there is no absolute evidence that there is no God or no creator, and that there is no absolute evidence that there is a creator. That there is no evidence for a creator, and there is no evidence against a creator. There can never be evidence for it. Even if we developed and found new evidence again and again that God does not exist, or that there can't be a God, religious experience and religious knowledge, theology would always develop, always revolutionize, always change, and always shape and bend itself in order to conform to new findings, and thereby again conclude that there is a God. So therefore, it is a completely vain attempt to disprove God. One can't disprove God. All we can do is to argue for believing or for disbelieving in God.
So QQ minus S, and I think this is to IP, Michael. If the universe comes from consciousness, then is some consciousness water that doesn't come from fire?
No, I mean, consciousness will not be those things. Those things would be contingent upon consciousness. I mean, water and fire would be bundled properties. We have to make a distinction here. Keith Ward and myself are dual aspect idealists. You have consciousness and you have the information that consciousness processes. Physical properties would be information. It wouldn't be consciousness. So just clarify on that.
So from Josue Guedes, I'm awful with pronouncing name. I can't even pronounce the word pronounce. Why think your position, I think this is to you, AP, why think your position is neutral if we can't make truth claims about metaphysics and only science? Is the claim life is meaningless equal God exists? That question is not super clear to me.
There might have been maybe there's a word missing.
Are they on par? Maybe he's asking, life is meaningless. Is it on par with the claim that God exists?
I would try to understand the last question is life is meaningless means God does not exist, or life is meaningful equals to God exists is what I would understand. Otherwise the question doesn't make sense to me. But why do you think your position is neutral? Okay, I think this refers to me saying that what is neutral, what is the neutral position here is that God does not exist, or that we simply cannot make such a conclusion. All we have is science, which we rely on, and that is the neutral position in this entire debate. I don't even think that is up to discussion, to be very honest. I think in a neutral state, when a human is born and lives a life, a human does not have any belief or disbelief. Somebody who does not believe in God does not actively disbelieve in God. Someone who doesn't believe in God only actively disbelieves in God from the perspective of somebody who does believe in God. If I do not believe in God, that means I'm not actively doing anything. I'm simply existing. Somebody who believes in God does actively choose to believe in God. When I talk about science, which I would want to separate from theology, and we only combine it at the moment because we are debating God for the sake of the argument, I would say that science is something that simply that relies on findings, on evidence, which is why it is objective. It is subjective only to the extent that we rely on certain evidence to come to certain conclusions. So insofar, not believing is neutral, and relying on science is neutral, if you want to have it so. To the last question, is the claim life is meaningless, God exists? Again, I don't know. I don't understand the question, but I would simply say that the human attempt to find meaning in life is one of the reasons why people want to believe that there is a God. I would say that life is inherently meaningless, which is not at all a depressing perspective. I think it's a much better, much more positive perspective. And if life is meaningless, then God does not exist.
So a question from PK for AP: Would you consider it possible to reach truth not by empirical evidence, but by a priori reason and philosophical reason?
Truth as in divine, as in God, I assume that is the question here.
I think it's more
They don't
general.
specify.
I would say it's more
They
general.
don't say divine
so,
truth. Yeah.
Can you arrive at like truth, like other means, I guess, no, without actually empirically investigating something?
Well, I wouldn't say I wouldn't consider myself entirely materialistic in that I say that everything that is true, it depends on empirical evidence, on only findings that that there is no philosophical, no you know reasoning. That's not what I would ever argue. I would only say that this would be applicable in a field like the existence of God. I do have many other conclusions about life and philosophy in general that are based on philosophy that lean on some evidence, but that are not completely reliant on evidence exclusively. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
This one looks like a follow-up from the very first question that we got to. I'm not going to try to pronounce this one again. You can see it on the screen. For AP, would objectivity of moral values constitute evidence for the existence of God if moral values actually were objective, which you may not hold?
Objective of moral values constitute. Well, it depends on how you define objective moral values. If we say that the thing is, if we don't believe in a God, then we cannot believe that there are, or we can most likely not believe that there are objective moral values in the world that exist. From with a coming from a natural origin that everybody has to naturally abide by, that everybody is asked to abide by. Such a belief is simply absurd. If we define objective moral values as values that are universal, which we hold something to be true, and we want everyone everywhere to abide by this, then I don't think this would have any implications about God at all. I don't see how we could conclude that objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. We cannot come to such a conclusion that objective moral values exist to begin with. If we go into meta-ethics, we see that moral values have developed over time and have evolved out of necessity, out of humans trying to live together and be safe. And that would not make any implication about God. On the contrary, it would further give us some arguments against God.
So we'll only have a few more questions that we'll be able to get to today. This one's from Abel. He says, he or she, have you considered investigating the teachings of Jesus? If all his teachings are true, then God is real because Jesus taught that God exists.
Thank you so much for the question. I really like the character of Jesus. I think Jesus is my favorite religious character from all the religious history that we have. And I don't even care if Jesus existed or not. That's, I think, a completely irrelevant discussion in this regard. His teachings, his moral teachings, mostly I find nice, mesmerizing, beautiful. When it comes to his theological teachings, I simply do not find very much there that we can really analyze. When it comes to the truth of Christianity, it relies more on whether the books, the Bible that we have, are authentic in their history, and I think that is a much more questionable, a much more difficult topic to analyze, which needs further investigation.
Okay, so Mickey Assume sent in another super chat, and he wants to clarify his earlier super chat or question. He says, to explain, if we reject proportionality, non-consciousness causing consciousness, what else would limit the effects of a cause? We would still want to say that, for example, fire doesn't make water because it has no water or H2O properties. So, what is your response?
I can't really very well comprehend this right now. My mind is a little bit all over the place. But
yeah, I might actually have to phone a friend here. Michael, do you understand what he's getting at here?
Let me read it. If we reject proportionality, non-conscious causing consciousness, so if we reject the idea that non-consciousness can cause consciousness, what else would limit the effect? Would we still want to say that fire doesn't make water because it has no water? I mean, I guess he's trying to say that the idea that consciousness is so different from the physical, if we could say that matter could create something entirely other than itself, namely consciousness, wouldn't we say the same thing for other things, like the fire could create water or water could create fire kind of thing? It's going back to the hard problem of consciousness, the idea that this is my interpretation. I could be way off, but what I'm getting from this in his previous comment is that if we're going to say that somehow matter can create consciousness, and again, there's just nothing there. As Ned Block says, we have nothing, not a zilch, not a researchers are stumped on how the brain could create consciousness. We might as well accept all sorts of other things could come from properties that are unlike them in all sorts of ways. So water could just come from fire. I think that's what he's getting at. It's just going back to the hard problem.
AP, does that?
It's I simply do not. I don't know. Maybe it's just a complete failure on my part to understand the relation here. But I simply do not understand. First off, how we would conclude that a conscious mind, a conscious system creates consciousness, how we would to begin with come to that conclusion, which is my entire initial problem that I have with Mike's argument here. But I wouldn't understand how then this relates to fire doesn't make water because it has no water H2O properties.
So I think Michael
blame it on my yeah.
No, I think Michael was on to what I think is sort of behind his question here, which is the hard problem. So I wanted to ask Michael, take a couple minutes and just explain what the hard problem is, and then maybe we can have a discussion along those lines.
It's too hard. No. Okay. I was just thinking, someone said in the chat, maybe Thales fire is made from water, because Thales is an ancient Greek philosopher who thought all was water. So the hard problem is essentially this. The hard problem of consciousness is, how do you get consciousness from matter or brain? You may think, well, it just is, but there's a problem here. So think of like your first person experience. You are self-aware, you're able to, you have intentionality. How do you get something like intentionality from chemical reactions in the brain where there is no intentionality? How do you get meaning from something in the brain when there really is no meaning in the brain? It's just the bouncing around of chemicals and whatnot. So think of all the first person experiences we have, things like will, intentionality, ability to introspect, self-awareness. All of these are secondary. I think of it like in terms of analogy is what I use. So you have meaning, you have a page of paper with writing on it. Okay, in a world without minds, all you have is a piece of paper with ink blots on it. The only thing that puts meaning on that page is when it experiences a mind and is able to interpret the words on there. Meaning seems to be something mental, divorced from the physical. You can transfer meaning in there, but it only makes sense to minds. So there's a whole entire ontological distinction between the subjectiveness of consciousness, the first person experience of consciousness, your intentionality, all these types of things. Sam Harris even says, you can introspect all day, you can think about, your own consciousness. At no point are you going to get to the idea of neurons bouncing around in your brain. The very idea of thinking about your own consciousness doesn't even seem to align with the chemical process of the brain. So this is the hard problem coined by David Chalmers. How do you get all these first-person experiences, these first-person qualities out of things that are not first-person experiences? So that's the hard problem. There's an epistemic gap in between brain and consciousness.
Something that helped me out with this. Unless you're good, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So one of the things that helped me out, because the mind, philosophy of mind, is an area that personally I just haven't done a whole lot of research into myself. So, but I heard this and it helped me understand the hard problem a little bit better. There's something called the Chinese room experiment, and correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, but it's something like if we were to like take a bunch of people and make them perform different functions that, say, your neurons are doing in your brain. If we were to take like billions of people, set them up in different rooms, and basically make them function like neurons,
No. Let me try to explain it, because you're getting a little bit off. So the Chinese room experiment is this idea by John Sear. He says, imagine you're in a Chinese room and people are sliding Chinese symbols under the door on paper. Now, you can't read Chinese, but you have an instruction manual in English in there as well. And it says, like, if you get these Chinese symbols, take these other Chinese symbols and slide them out under the door. Now, imagine you were there for a while and you get really good at it. So you're indistinguishable from a native Chinese speaker. Question, do you understand Chinese? Well, no, you know how to manipulate symbols. So his point is there's a difference between manipulating syntax and doing semantics. You can do syntax, you can manipulate syntax without actually understanding the meaning of something. So there's a difference between just manipulating stuff. And his argument is not so much the hard problem, it's just to show that machine learning could never really become conscious because machines just manipulate syntax around. They don't actually understand the meaning of what they're doing. They're just trying to, change symbols in and out. And in the Chinese room, you're just changing symbols in and out.
All right, so
it was hard for me to compare this whole process to compare this whole idea to what the question in the super chat asked about water and fire, which to me seems like, I don't know, maybe it's just it is not my field at all. I've never looked into this. I've never properly gone through it. Doesn't seem like a comparison that seems fair, close, accurate. Which is why I do not really know how to answer the question, to be very honest. I simply do think that this is a very dark, very cloudy field of philosophy and science, not even science, simply philosophy, that that is controversial, that people think about, that we need to explore in the future, which is not something that we can really have conclusions about and definitive discussions on.
Fair enough. All right, so that's where we're going to leave the debate itself, and then we can just kind of unwind. You can take a breath. We're done. And but I did want to say again, thank you so much for coming on, Apostate Prophet AP. It was great to have you here. It's great to actually be able to talk with you in person. And then Michael, it's been great to have you back on. Like I said, I've got both of these guys linked in the description of this video. So if you want to hear more what they have to say, then just go do a little drop down, click their channels, and again, subscribe to their channels. And I think you'll really like what they're both doing. So is there anything that you guys would like to leave with the audience before we close it out?
Just thank you so much again for offering this opportunity. Thank you for making this possible. I loved having this conversation. This was actually my first real debate and my first ever proper debate on this topic too. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed talking to you, Michael. Sorry if there was ever any miscommunication. I hope to do similar things again and explore truth again. Thank you so much, and thanks to everybody for watching.
Great.
All right, yeah. Thanks for having me, Cameron. I appreciate it. Nice talking with you, AP. It was nice to finally meet you since I've seen a lot of your stuff on Islam, and I thought it was pretty good. But yeah, great conversation. I appreciate coming back, and hopefully we'll do it again sometime soon.
All right.
Thanks.
That's going to do it for us. Thank you guys for tuning in today. If you want to support this ministry, this channel, then head over to patreon.com/capturingchristianity. Links to that are in the description of the video to make sure that everything keeps up and running and that we can continue to put out videos like this. So thank you so much for watching again, and we will see you guys later.